Good evening, everyone. Thank you guys all for coming, and thank you guys for patiently waiting. I would like to introduce Jessica Wetters, who drove all the way from Poughkeepsie, New York to give her a lovely presentation. So she is part of Mass Design Group, which is a nonprofit organization, and it stands for Model of Architecture Serving Society. It's a group of leaders dedicated to supporting communities and rebuilding futures. So senior architect Jessica Wetters works out of their Poughkeepsie, New York office, where they focus on fringe cities rebuilding smaller cities struggling to rebuild themselves. So I'd like to hand it over to Jessica now for her amazing presentation. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure being at an event in person. It's taken us all such a long time to get here. So happy to be here and happy to share some of the work that we're doing at Mass and some of the past work that I have done outside of Mass. So when I was asked to give the name of this talk, the phrase that stood out immediately to me was a phrase that we've been using to describe a project that I will go into more detail about later in the presentation. The old techniques and new typologies. What does this mean? And how does it apply to the work that we're doing today? When I thought about it, it actually describes much of the work that we're doing at Mass. Architecture, buildings, and the built environment has become really complex, especially in urban cities where we find the largest populations. And I don't so much mean the geometries or the structures themselves, but even those are pretty complicated. But I'm talking about the mechanical systems, the structural systems, the codes, what kind of materials we're using, where we're getting them from. Steel from Canada and China, glass from the Middle East, furniture from China. Why? Why are we getting everything overseas? Why are we not doing it locally? Is it all to save money? Is it all to build what we think is a more economically efficient project? We have to ask, what is the real cost? And can we do better? And my response, and I think my firm's response to that, is that we must do better. It is our professional responsibility to do better. And if not us, then who will? So Mass started its work in Rwanda, Africa, building hospitals and schools literally by hand. They engaged the entirety of the local population, mobilized them, and got to work. Let's see. So the photo right here that you see is a wine cellar that is literally built into the side of the earth. It might be said that so going back to Rwanda, it might be said that they have the benefit of building in a place that's free of the constraining codes that we have to deal with here in the United States, but they don't have the benefit of machines and equipment, sophisticated labor, capital, and investment. This lack yielded a different type of architecture, one that was free from many of the constraints that we face today, one that was simpler, local, built by hand, and arguably more beautiful. Unquestionably, it's one that is better for the environment. So I've been with Mass since May of this year, so I'm very much still new to the firm. But like many people that I've learned, have been following their work for a long time. Prior to Mass, I've had about a 20-year career in architecture and had the opportunity to work on many different scales and types of projects in Canada, New York City, throughout the Northeast, Midwest, and with many different firms over the years. I've also had the chance to start my own small practice, taking on smaller projects in and around New York City. So I'll start by taking you through a few of these projects first. So the first one is Journal Squared. It is in Jersey City, New Jersey, which is located in the heart of downtown Jersey City, and that's one path train stop from downtown Manhattan. This is the site outlined in red, which you can see prior to the buildings that stand there now. The most formal structure defining this area prior to the buildings that are there now is this concrete helix building. Well, it's not a building, it's a parking on-ramp that led to the parking lot at the train station. Journal Square is a business district, a residential area, and transportation hub where many commute to the city daily. Okay, next slide. I worked on this project with HWKN and in partnership with Handel Architects. What exists there today is two 82 and change story residential towers. The third one is being built right now. This is the tallest development in Jersey City and the tallest development basically on the west side of the Hudson River. It was designed to revitalize the urban void that by leveraging connections to transportation and existing population centers. Journal Square is a mixed-use high-rise development awarded through a design competition, which we partnered, Hawken and Handel Architects partnered, and basically won the project. What you can see in this image basically is at street level, but looking down, the three towers rise off of a podium that is central, or that belongs to all of the building and basically functions as the structural platform from which the three buildings rise. This is a ground floor plan, and you can see in the lower left corner the helix that still exists and that we tied into. So part of the challenge of this project was basically integrating the infrastructure that existed, being the train station, the pass station, all of the parking that had to be accommodated for, and putting up the three towers. This is a view at street level. And these buildings really revitalize this area. So like if you think back to the slide which showed the helix, which is just basically a city without a lot of life other than the transportation life that happens in the morning and the evenings. It has totally revitalized these streets. And this is a collection of images that basically show some of the amenities that are in the building, which has become sort of commonplace now to residential projects in and around the city. So the next project that I spent a good 4 years on or so is 400 Park Avenue South. This is a building designed by Christian Deportes and Park, architect in Paris. I worked with Handel Architects. We were the AOR for the project, and Christian was the design architect, which generally means you do a lot of the heavy lifting, and they come over, a couple times a year. So this is the corner of 28th Street and Park Avenue South. So if you're familiar with the city, it is literally smack dab in the middle of sort of southern Midtown. And which you can't really see very well here, but maybe in the bottom right corner is the green fencing that leads you down to the 6 train, the subway. So the subway was part of this project and also had to be integrated like the last project. This is a typical plan, which you can see is not so typical. Every single plan in the building was different. So when I show you what's built, all the walls were angled and they angled back in. So when you took a floor plan at every single floor of the 42-story tower, everything changed. So that necessitated a lot of manipulating plans, but also manipulating the vertical infrastructure throughout the building. Things didn't necessarily stack, which when they stack, it creates a much more efficient floor plan and a more efficient building. But this project went through a special zoning process in New York City called ULURP because it did not adhere to what is allowable by zoning. So that took some time to pass, but ultimately they felt that this building would really add something special to the neighborhood that it was in and revitalize this area of Midtown. So here are a few photos of when the building was in construction. The photo on the left, you can see the curtain wall starting to go up, probably a third of the way up the building. The photo in the middle is basically, you can see the orange construction guards surrounding the parapet. So that there were two small wings on this building, and the parapets basically extended up a good, I don't know, 30 or 40 feet or so, were poured out of concrete in the air. And that was challenging and fun for them to figure out the geometries of how these ring beams basically form the parapets. And then the photo on the right, you can see basically this is one of the last floor pours. We were again in Midtown. You can see the Empire State Building, which was just a few blocks away. And these are photos of the building complete. So the photo on the left, obviously during the day, and you know, it has a very transparent light feel to it. The facade of the building basically had about 30 different types of glass, some that were totally transparent, others that were translucent, others that had frit, others that were triple glazed, others that were double glazed. So it was in every aspect of this building. At the time, it was probably the most complicated project going on in the city, if not beyond, getting all those geometries correct. And then again, here are a few photos of the amenity spaces within the building, which again has sort of become commonplace to New York City residential buildings, certainly high-end ones. Okay, and then the last project, or I guess there's one more after this, but the Viola. This is a project that I did with Handel Architects, and it was also a competition. It is located at the corner of Mass Ave and Boylston Street. And looking through my notes, it was actually supposed to be completed about 4 years ago, but they are still going through the permitting process. So it's not there. Hopefully it will get built. But if you're familiar with this corner in Boston, the really interesting thing about this project, and several around Boston, is that it is actually paving over, well, it is structuring a deck over the Mass Pike. So what exists there right now is a big, you know, open to below. So you can see the Mass Pike in below this, you know, below what is the street level here. In the early 2000s, the city of Boston basically identified many parcels around the city that were slated to be redevelopment sites. A lot of them have been built already, and there are some that are still remaining. So this one will be a great sort of finish to the corner of Boylston and Mass Ave, which is a busy intersection, and it's a notable place in the city. It's also right across the street from the Berkeley School of Music. So here is a ground floor plan. Whoops. And I guess you're sort of seeing a theme in these projects, but this one also has a subway stop at the base of the building. So you can see the area in green are the two subway stops. So the one on the left is the Mass Ave stop, and then the one on the right is the Boylston T stop. The plan in the upper left hand, the white part that's not colored, is actually the old Tower Records, which I'm not sure if it's a Best Buy still, but it's sort of a landmark at that corner in Boston. The area below that in the cyan color was area that was designated for Berklee School of Music. And then as you sort of see the exploded axon going up the building, the purple was designated for hotel use and the blue was designated for residential condominiums. And then at the base of the building, you can see what would be the infrastructure of the T below. These are a couple of views basically on, well, the top view is on Boylston Street. And so the undulating curve of the building was done more to, I would say, as an urban infrastructure move to pull in the building and give a grandiose street, presence and activity space. The terracotta fins are sort of an ode to the red brick that is, all over Boston, and how do we reimagine these materials in a more contemporary way. And then the view down on the bottom left is from Newbury Street. And so you can see the building in the background that basically has a relationship to those brick street front facades on historic Newbury Street. And then the bottom right, again, is a view of the front of the building down Boylston Street, and the building that's the smaller pitched roof building is the Boston College of Architecture. And then after working, for several years at large firms doing large scale urban projects, I wondered what I could do on my own. And so I took a stab at that and grew a small practice slowly, doing projects, mostly residential, but also some commercial, smaller scale commercial in and around New York City and Brooklyn. Probably similar to, well, we're in Rhode Island, not in Boston, but there are a lot of townhouses in New York City, a lot of them that haven't been touched, since 50s, 60s, that are in serious need of some care. So that is a bread and butter project for a lot of smaller architecture firms in the city. This is one that I did in Cobble Hill. And this is another residential interior project on the Upper West Side that actually is in a multi-unit building. And sometimes I would do multiple units in a building. Okay, so the story of Mass. Let's see where we are here. So unfortunately, I was not able to embed the video of 60 minutes on this presentation. I don't know if any of you have watched 60 Minutes on Sunday, but they have been following us around for a good few months. They went to Rwanda, they went to Boston, they went to Poughkeepsie. I believe they went to a few other projects in Africa as well. And I would encourage everybody to go online and watch it. But so I'm not going to necessarily do this justice, but I'm going to tell you, if you don't know, a little bit about Michael Murphy, who founded Mass. And the way I was introduced to him was actually when I was just out of graduate school and working in Boston. And I went to a lecture, and he was at the Boston Society of Architects, and he was sort of pitching what was to become Mass. He had graduated, I think, or was in the process of, or maybe he hadn't graduated yet, but he was trying to figure out how to become a nonprofit and work on projects that did not follow the typical architecture firm model, right? It seemed kind of impossible and like a great aspiration, but how do you do that? He also talked about what inspired him to become an architect. And he was an English literature major in his undergrad and came home after graduation, which is his home is in Poughkeepsie. And his father was dying of cancer. And so he came home to wait for him to die and to be there with him. And said, what can I do with my time while I'm here? And so he started working on their old Victorian home, which was a project that his dad also loved to do, restoring the house. And so a few weeks went by, his dad got a little bit better. A few more weeks went by, his dad started getting even more better. They started working on the house together. But in the interim, like going with his dad to the hospital and looking at the surroundings of where he was supposed to get better, sort of question like these buildings, like, you know, are these buildings supposed to make us better? You know, this is terrible. This is not a place to go to heal. This is a place to go to die. So long story short, his father actually did go into remission. They refinished the house and he went to architecture school at Harvard. So pretty inspiring story. And he tells that at the beginning of 60 Minutes. And so I would say definitely go watch it. But he, so let's see. So Mass, which Lorena already talked about, the model of architecture serving society. Our mission is to build, research, and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity. I think that is present in all of the work that we do. In addition to serving society, we believe that architecture, it's never neutral. It either hurts or it heals. There really isn't sort of a gray line. And we believe that architecture is good, that everybody deserves good design. And good design is beautiful and just, and it is essential to delivering human rights, essential services, spaces that will build a better world. It's clean, or it needs to be clean. Being climate positive is an imperative. Our projects strive for not only efficient operation, but the design of the entire supply chain to be resilient, restorative, and regenerative. And architecture needs to be fair. Looking at design and construction process holistically, from the material extraction to assembly, operation, and to ensure that we have safe and equitable labor practices. Mass is a nonprofit 503c organization. It's the largest nonprofit architecture firm in the world. There may only be a few others. I'm not even aware of any others. But as I mentioned before, this is a very atypical model for an architecture firm, which is why there are so few of them. What this does is we work with charitable foundations like the Dyson Foundation and the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund, as well as individual philanthropists who seek to support projects such as the ones that we are doing. This means that most of our clients are also non-for-profit organizations, and they're often mission aligned. Well, they're almost always mission aligned. Otherwise, they would not seek us out. We partnered with over 100 different organizations in 20 different countries. And we built a unique model of practice. Mass is nonprofit, which allows us to focus on projects, research, and advocacy to push on innovation for social impact. We built a deep bench of expertise in serving other nonprofits to conceptualize and visualize their ambitions and to use the power of design to deliver on those ambitions, as well as unlock the funding that's required to do so. Today, we're over a team of 200 architects, landscape architects, engineers, builders, furniture designers, writers, filmmakers, researchers, and we represent 20 countries across the globe. We believe in expanding access to design that is purposeful, healing, and hopeful. This diagram describes basically how we expand the role of the architect at Mass to include work that is both upstream and downstream of where an architect is typically engaged in a project. So what this shows is basically we get involved very early on, and we actually create a lot of the projects that we do. We go out into the community and we find where there is need, and we immerse ourselves in that community. And we find partners with people who live in those communities. Poughkeepsie certainly being one of them. So our projects start, I mean, they could, start 5 years before they actually start, right? So there's an acquisition period, a visioning period, a planning period. That happens before design. That actually often happens as part of a Catalyst fund that we sponsor, or we do a lot of pro bono work too, if the project is mission aligned with our goals. And then we do, the design, construction, evaluation, and operations. So. Okay, so the project that Michael basically used as his thesis for graduate school was the Butaro District Hospital in Rwanda. He basically, the Butaro Hospital, following the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, the government of Rwanda committed to a 2-decade rebuilding of the nation's health system. In 2007, Butaro was one of the last 2 districts in Rwanda without a tertiary care hospital, leaving a population of 340,000 people without access to a single doctor. As partners in health's mission to bring high quality healthcare to the country's poorest regions, a district-wide plan, increase access, was developed in partnership with the Rwandan Ministry of Health. This plan began with the creation of a new district hospital in Butaro. So Michael started working on this project while he was at Harvard, and by missing the proximity, he was not there, and drawing a building, in Boston versus being on the ground in Rwanda was a very different experience. He ultimately took off a year in graduate school and went to Rwanda to basically experience what the conditions were like, what the community was like, and what could actually be built. Because as you know, I mean, in Rwanda, they do not have, there's very little that was there. They do not have anything in the means of skilled labor, machines, equipment, capital, etc. So this is a photo of the finished hospital, and centered around a umbara tree, which is a traditional gathering place in Rwanda. The hospital is landscape campus of buildings on the terraced hillside. The 150-bed hospital is designed to mitigate and reduce the transmission of airborne disease through various systems, including overall layout, patient and staff flows, natural cross ventilation. And inside the hospital wards, each patient is offered a large window of the landscape, as well as natural light and ventilation. Cross ventilation is supported through the use of high volume fans, louvers, and operable windows, and high ceilings to circulate the air comfortably and reduce the risk of reinfection among the patients. So this has really become something notable and important that we are looking at. I mean, that Mass has been asked in light of COVID to look at a number of health facilities throughout the United States and how their plans are set up, how their patient beds are set up, what mechanical systems they use, and what is the health and safety factor for the air that is trapped for the most part in most health facilities in this country. And so while this model may not be fully replicable in the United States, it's a starting point, and it's something that we definitely need to consider while we are building here in the United States. Sourcing local materials such as the volcanic rock from the Vigera mountain chain and working with local craftspeople delivered a site approach and sustainable design and reduced the project's embodied carbon and ensured that 85% of the building costs were reinvested back into the local economy. What else came out of this project was that they mobilized 4,000 people in the local economy who did not, prior to this project, have skills, building skills, architectural skills, et cetera. But they trained them and they work together, and they have, some of them have since actually gone on to become architects and become educated in the field, which is a really incredible and perhaps even maybe more measure of success for the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fringe cities and disinvested places. And the photo on the left is that of Butaro, Rwanda. And then the photo on the right is that of Poughkeepsie. And both are places of disinvestment by any measure. While they're very different culturally, geographically, climate, the road to recovery actually shares a lot in common. And this idea of what is replicable, what can we do? What can we do in all? What is the thread that is shared in all of these places? So Poughkeepsie, New York. In 2017, basically was the beginning of the work that began out of the Poughkeepsie office. There were one partner and 2 Columbia students who basically first put boots on the ground at our office in the Hudson Valley in Poughkeepsie. This was the first office, and this is when it was standing up, but one of the buildings next to it, I believe it was the one on the left, actually fell down and fell on top of it and crushed this office. Thankfully, nobody was hurt, but it is sort of a irony about the state of some of the buildings in Poughkeepsie. This is our office day in 2021. It is a building that basically we built and rehabilitated, and we are right in the middle of Main Street, and we have a number of projects at varying scales spread out all over the city and the region. So we learned 3 main important lessons from our work in Butaro. One was the power of design to unlock capital in disinvested places. The second was the power of working upstream. And the third was the value of being proximate. It's important to be where you're working. It's important to be in the community. It's important to be living and working and experiencing what it is that you're doing. Poughkeepsie was once a manufacturing hub at the turn of the century and produced a lot of paper and textiles. And we are located about an hour and a half outside of New York City by train. Originally, the city plan reflected that of what many river cities do, where Main Street is perpendicular to the river. when urban renewal in the 60s changed this fundamental order with the introduction of the east and west arterials, it created an enclosure or an island effect around Main Street, and it cut it off from what were the natural pedestrian and vehicle traffic patterns. So it still remains today easy to come to Poughkeepsie and never actually go down Main Street, that you would just circle around this artery and you never see the heart of the city. So coupled with departure of manufacturing overseas, this vacancy island basically ensued. And here's a photo of what urban renewal looks like. While the practice of urban renewal may have started with good intentions in the late 1940s to bring economic reform and development to urban areas across the country, it's had a devastating effect in many of these smaller cities where, you know, they were essentially razed and left behind. So here's a result, and this is Poughkeepsie today. Pockets left over from unrealized plans and the demolition for parking lots and this new car-based urbanism. So this is street level showing oversized infrastructure for the current population, and again, lots of parking. And here's a photo of Main Street today, which sees a large homeless population all day. The city is caught between disinvestment and great potential. And the feeling of being on the verge of reinvention is actually palpable there. You can feel it. But in order to implement this change or sustainable change, we need to understand how we got here in order to know how to move forward. Located at the intersection of Main Street and Hudson River is the longest elevated pedestrian bridge in the world. It's called the Walkway over the Hudson. And it was, it's the Poughkeepsie Highland Railroad Bridge was originally built in 1889. It transported raw materials to the city in the east. And fire destroyed the tracks in 1974. So this large piece of infrastructure basically sat untouched until 2009. They wanted to take it down, but that was going to be cost prohibitive. And then what do you do with all of this steel? So they turned it into a pedestrian bridge, and today it brings 600,000 people annually to Poughkeepsie to walk over the bridge. So turning aging infrastructure into valuable assets. But today, the city is still trapped in the past in some respects, and it's also hopeful for a brighter future. So I'm going to talk about two projects that we are working on currently in the Hudson Valley. The first one is Scenic Hudson, and if you watch the 60 Minutes segment, they dedicate some time to this project, which is really wonderful. So Scenic Hudson was founded in 1963, and they are the Hudson Valley's largest environmental organization. They're often credited with launching modern grassroots environmental movement, and the nonprofit organization is committed to preserving and strengthening the region's great assets, parks, farms, and revitalizing historic cities and town centers. If you're familiar with the area, you know how beautiful it is and what a draw Storm King Mountain is. In the early 1960s, Con Edison proposed a hydroelectric plant on the side of Storm King Mountain, which never happened because of community action and the beginnings of Scenic Hudson. Had this hydroelectric plant actually been built, it would have drastically changed the ecology of the Hudson Valley region, and likely not for the better. So MASS's relationship with Scenic Hudson first began through pro bono work, visioning work that we did for the Fallkill Creek, which is a 38-mile long waterway that begins in the town of Hyde Park and flows westward to Poughkeepsie, ultimately draining in the Hudson River. The Fallkill once powered the city's 19th century manufacturing industry through a system of mill ponds. And today the creek winds through residential properties, backyards, under streets, and it's largely forgotten. Mass became acquainted with the creek more through tragedy, which was that after Hurricane Irene, it flooded the city. And it has now become a popular dumping site, plaguing the city as a hazard rather than as supporting public enjoyment and the natural wonders that nature has to offer. So not so dissimilar from the Highline Project in New York City. I guess we can sort of think about this as a low line, but Mass envisioned transforming this creek from a liability into an asset. Mass and Scenic Hudson got together and invited community members to a series of engagements throughout the city to learn about the creek and to share ideas for improving public access and stewardship. And so here's a plan showing new access points to the creek that will link together existing activities throughout the city and provide opportunities for ecological education and recreation. So following the work that was done, when Scenic Hudson started looking for a permanent office headquarters, they explored 3 possible locations and naturally landed at the intersection of the Fallkill Creek, which is the blue line, and then the walkway over the Hudson, which is basically the Duchess Rail Trail line. This is the collection of buildings, which is going to be the future Scenic Hudson. It's the Fallkill Creek is in their backyard, and it was important for them to think about their home as more than a building, but as an extension of the park system and the land that they seek to preserve. So the group of buildings here is an old, grouping of factory buildings, and up until 2002, it was operational. It was owned by the Standard Gauge Factory, which built equipment dials for machine equipment. And this is what it looks like today, which is a group of buildings that were left that have decayed and that sit atop a brownfield site, which is contaminated, fairly highly contaminated, but it is in an industrial and manufacturing town and site, and this is not atypical for these types of buildings and sites. But what we have to do is basically we need to remediate the site. So we're not able to basically get a certificate of occupancy or revitalize this building until dealing and responsibly either taking the contamination off-site, which we don't want to do because basically that is, putting the problem somewhere else. The problem still exists, but you're just trucking it away. So the strategy is to keep as much of the soil on site as possible. We are building landscape berms. We are putting it across the street, in which you can see is actually part of their property as well. It is a parking lot, which will serve both this building, and it also serves visitors to walkway over the Hudson. We're building up the land, but we are trying to keep it on site. This is a diagram that shows basically all of the different buildings that compose the complex currently. And this is what it will be following demolition. This project is not on the historic register. However, it is historically noteworthy. and it may ultimately end up on the historic register. And so we are required to keep all buildings that that have any historic importance. So the unique, this project's one of its more unique qualities is the potential to be carbon net positive on day one, as the embodied carbon costs have already been paid. So are we carbon positive or are we negative? Basically, we're using a high performance envelope, which takes cues from the historic building combined with minimal mechanical systems that are integrated with the envelope to minimize energy use. The center's annual electricity use is powered by on-site photovoltaics. So basically, to be carbon neutral, you have to produce as much energy as you use. We will be putting solar panels on 4 of the roofs of these buildings, and basically to generate the capacity of the energy that we will be using. And again, because this is an adaptive reuse project, the embodied carbon has already been paid. We're not bringing a lot of new materials to the site. So this is a building section, and you can see basically the top is what exists today, and the bottom is its restored building section. The windows have been blocked up with CMU, and that was done to basically minimize the amount of fresh air that was coming into the building and light. So we're restoring it, but we actually want to do the opposite. We want to bring in as much light as possible, and we want to bring in the fresh air. So one of the main architectural features of the building is this central atrium that's punctuated by a glass pop-up that assists in naturally ventilating and exhausting the building. And the diagram on the right basically shows how fresh air is brought in from the perimeter and then exhausted out the top of the building. And again, here is another diagram which shows it in a bit more detail. But typically, buildings are usually put under positive pressure. The question of where does our air come from in the building isn't typically very transparent. Fresh air comes in usually through a highly controlled supply intake somewhere in the facade, and then it's distributed throughout the building through a series of ducts, putting the building under positive pressure. The passive system that we're proposing is actually the complete opposite of that scenario. Fresh air is brought in through a small trickle vent at the base of every window. It enters a small enclosure that houses a fin tube, which either heats or cools the air and enters the office space. This effectively eliminates the need for energy-intensive mechanical fans, ductwork, refrigerant that is typically used in a VRF system, and significantly reduces the amount of energy consumed and therefore the carbon footprint. And just going back to the atrium of tomorrow versus the atrium of today. Here's a rendering of what the interior of that space will look like. And this is a photo of what the office space looks like today and what it will look like once the building is restored. And so this is a rendering, obviously, of what is being proposed and what we hope that that scenic Hudson will look like. You can see all the photovoltaics on all the roofs and the green roof and the windows being restored. Okay, and the last project is that of Stone Barns. And Stone Barns is located in Tarrytown, New York. As I was driving here, I sort of remembered that I didn't put in a photo of what Stone Barns looks like, but I think this you can see in the background, it is a good example of the building structure, the buildings that exist at this very, very special farm in the Hudson Valley. So Stone Barns Food and Agricultural Center is part of an 80-acre nonprofit farm and nature preserve that was developed by David Rockefeller. The organization has been shaping an ecological food culture for the past 20 years, and it is a culture that is directly tied to place, the local conditions, and the seasons. It's been doing so in partnership with a world-class restaurant on site called Blue Hill. There's a Blue Hill in New York City, and then there's Blue Hill at Stone Barns, led by the visionary chef Dan Barber. And if you're not familiar with Dan, there is a Netflix documentary series that was out a few years ago, and he is, I believe, the first episode, but truly, truly inspiring. So Stone Barns is located 45 minutes north of New York City and an hour south of our office in Poughkeepsie. The Hudson Valley has a very rich history, agricultural history, yet in some ways it's also a food desert, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you've read Dan Barber's book called The Third Plate, you know about his theory of third plate cuisine. It's a dish or a meal that can only exist in its time and place. And one of the great challenges and joys of this project has been correlating the understanding of this approach to food and to farming and then to architecture. So how can we design a building that can only exist in its place and time? A building that nourishes people and gives back to their ecologies rather than taking from them. So we correlate the first plate with the past. It is industrial without season or place. It tastes the same and looks the same everywhere, and it's optimized for uniformity and efficiency. So the second plate, which would be the present, might look a little different or not, but it's a shallow reinvention and it requires intensive outputs. It prioritizes consistency and is often opaque by design. And then the third plate, which is the future by definition, only is possible in that place and time, and answers to regenerative, complex, and balanced feedback loops at multiple scales. So what are we designing at Stone Barns? We are looking to design 3 new barnyards that will distribute varied activities around the 80-acre site. The lower barnyards will be a new fabrication and facilities workshop. The upper barnyard will be a new livestock center, and the innovation courtyard will serve as the new hub for experimentation, education, and innovation. And Mass has spent the last 2 years learning about and defining basically the intricate needs and aspirations of the center, which has resulted in a very large 2.0 master plan. We actually finished yesterday the schematic design phase of the project, and we will be moving into design development in the new year. So what sustainable strategies have we employed or can we employ, and given that this is new construction, right? So the project is being designed to be net zero. Again, we are producing as much energy as we are using. And that in and of itself is a very long process of measuring and calculating the data. What systems exist right now and what systems are we proposing? And how do we lower the amount and capacity of energy that they're using right now? So in addition to utilizing local low carbon materials, such as hempcrete shear walls, reclaimed wood cladding, rammed earth floors, straw bale insulation, and gabion terrace walls, we are building also a sustainable biofuel plant, and solar panels will ultimately provide enough power to transition the campus off of fossil fuels. And this is a wall section, sort of a schematic wall section that illustrates how some of these materials will be used. So the idea of a root cellar is one that has resonated strongly in this project. And one of the challenges that they face is basically solving for March and finding a way to extend the livability of our food. So we live, in in an area that has 4 seasons, and you can only grow, for half of that time. And so how do you increase the length and the life of the food that's being grown? Because the food that's grown there on the farm is the food that is also being served at the restaurant, right? It's fully farm to table. So by using the earth itself and the thermal mass of soil, we've used this architectural typology as a point of departure. We think the root cellar built in the hillside gives us a precedent here on campus of the place where we can learn from the past, from indigenous knowledge, and pilot a future of architecture that basically learns from and builds upon the historic infrastructure that already exists in this place. And the photo that I showed at the beginning of the presentation with the stone wall, that is a wall and a door that leads into a wine cellar that is on campus here at Stone Barns. So the 80-acre topography of Stone Barns is that of a steep hillside, and the original Norman-style stone buildings took advantage of that hillside by building into it. So in the same spirit, the new buildings will do the same and leverage the thermal mass of the earth like a root cellar. Passive heating and cooling will be made possible through operable windows and also a large underground earth duct that acts as a plenum for tempered fresh air to enter the building and offset the needs for intensive mechanical systems. Facades and roof systems take advantage of the sun and daylight for the winter and shading in the summer, with solar panels on the south and east roofs. We are implementing the sawtooth roof for some of the structures, and we are optimizing that roof structure for passive ventilation and radiation year-round. And finally, the rainwater retention and system design is focused on rainwater capture and pervious surfaces that allow water to infiltrate back into the land and restore the wetlands and not ever reach the municipal sewer. And that is it.
Thank you all for coming. Does anyone have any questions? We're going to open the floor to questions now. Anyone want to start?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I'm wondering, like, perhaps how the process that you go through before you get to knowing exactly what you need. It seems like everything is built specifically for like a very big. I didn't know how the process was.
So I can describe to you a project that basically we have visioned, and there was a YMCA that has sat vacant in Poughkeepsie for I don't know how many years, 20 years, more than 20 years. The community doesn't have any, or the city doesn't have a community center. There's no pool, there's nowhere for the youth to like go and play basketball or like what you would typically have at a community center. And that has become really apparent. And so we petitioned the city, the municipality, which actually owned this land and owned the building that sat vacant on this land, and said, hey, like, can we buy the land? Can we do something with it? But, and can we get funding for it? Can we basically start a catalyst fund, you know, with our partners, with philanthropists, with developers in the area who want to do something. So that process takes quite a long time to go through the city and to, you know, basically build what will be the project, right? And so, and then it also went through sort of a competition, you know, where they invited different architecture firms to submit, you know, their vision of what, you know, once we got through that hurdle, then we're invited to, you know, not just us, but submit what we would do with the space. And so ultimately, that is a project. We did get the project, but we also put in a whole lot of work, you know, for years prior to ever it, you know, generating and becoming a project, right? So like what you see that I presented with Stone Barns, that, you know, they really had no idea what they wanted or what they needed, but they knew that, you know, they had a lot more to offer than what the public knows about. And they knew that they needed to basically increase their space and prepare for the future, right? So our visioning plan for them and what we put together as a master plan for them, it took 2 years, right? And that was, you know, intense interviews with the farm staff and with the restaurant staff, and, you know, and what does this place want to become? And so it is not, we generally do not go into projects with sort of a, you know, I don't want to say, like, I don't think we're known to be like an architecture firm that has like a style of building and we, you know, go in and then we build that building. It really is much more about the process and figuring out what the need is, and then letting that generate what the architecture becomes.
So I know you talked about doing some projects other than with Mass in the beginning. I'm not sure if those were for profit or not for profit, but do you find doing not for profit work more or less rewarding?
So those were definitely for profit. Those are your typical model, you know, large architecture firm, big city, developer dollars, right? And the budgets are large. And there's definitely something rewarding about, you know, being on a project like that and, you know, building a 42-story tower. I mean, you know, you get to go to New York and say, you know, I was a part of that. And it is also, you know, these projects last for 3-4 years. They are an education in and of themselves, right? And so so absolutely that is rewarding. But I think for me, after having done multiple projects like that, I think I needed something different, and I needed something spiritually different for myself. So like I said, I've been following Mass for a long time, and their work resonated with me for, you know, reasons that those large projects, they're not for everybody, right? They're for a certain group of people, usually people, you know, who can afford them. And I think, you know, when I started practicing, I think the world was in a different place than it is now. And I think that we had the opportunity and the skill in, you know, our profession to make a change. I think we are largely responsible, like, to make that change. And so anyway, so yeah, so I'm, yeah. Anything else? Uh-huh.
So as a student, I have no idea. Very expensive.
Yeah, that's great. I think, the town also, we haven't let a lot out, right? Like, so they know something's happening. They don't know what. And we just in the next like couple of months will be meeting with the town. And so it will start to like, become public. But I think they have often been criticized or for being closed, right? So the campus itself is the preserve is open. There are hikers there at all the time, and that land in some ways belongs to the public. But what they do there is not very public, right? Like, and to have a meal there, it's very expensive, and so it's not something that's actually accessible to everybody. I don't know if in the future that is going to change, but what I can say is that the work, the innovation, the change that they are trying to make to food culture and to farming and agriculture spans this country, if not further. They invite a lot of farmers there who are trying to change their farms over to regenerative farming from industrialized farming. And so these, this sort of small place actually has very big reach. And so I think, part of what we're doing with them is helping them reach more people.
So, when I think like in a lot of the math design projects, like it's all about promoting something that's like it's a huge need, big purpose in that area. It is so much fun. But when you design, is there a way to kind of obviously it's already, but is there a way to kind of help the community through design and architecture or just through visuals? Like, here is why we built.
Yeah. So sort of the other part of mass that I don't unfortunately get to work with very often is sort of the community engagement and immersion group, right? And so they are literally like people, boots on the ground, and they're out in the community and they're talking to people. And so like the project is called the YOU, which is the new Y Community Center, right? There was so much engagement with the community, asking them what they needed, right? Like literally like going door to door, having, a get together on Saturdays or like gatherings in the park, etc. There's surveys, etc. But asking the community what they want or what they need, right? And so that gives buy-in. Like you don't have the same resistance that you often have when developers or architects like go in and they are going to build another X where the community doesn't want it, right? Like so so that is 100% like the success, part of the success, that sets the foundation of the project. So yeah, there's and I mentioned, we work with over 200 architects, landscape architects, filmmakers, authors. Like we are a very multi diverse professional group of professionals, right? So the power of film and telling stories and the narrative through film is also something that Mass does, which is, it's really kind of part of not every project, but I think ultimately like becomes a part of every project, right? So, and that story, that narrative that is associated with the project is as important as a photo of the project or like me standing here and showing it to you, right? So again, I would just, if you've got, I think it's about 15 minutes or so, watch the 60-minute clip. And then there's like the after hours, which talks about why we hire all these other, people, why we have filmmakers and graphic designers and, communication specialists, et cetera, that so it's not just a practice of architecture. Yep.
So I was curious, you mentioned doing projects in other countries, specifically Rwanda and other. There's, like you said, not a lot of sophisticated workers. I was wondering, when those projects get done, is the company recruiting people in those areas and providing that education, or do they kind of like come visit, do the work, and then leave and not really leave anything like else? Like, does that make sense? It's kind
Yeah.
of like teach a man to fish.
Yeah. So I don't know the number of schools and hospitals and institutional projects that we have built in multiple different countries in Africa. But generally what happens is that we will send a core group of people from Mass, from the state team. They go and they live there. They live there for 4 years, 5 years at a time, whatever, and oversee and the projects. So what has happened, and I'm sorry, I don't know what universities, but a lot of the local people have actually, they've gotten their licenses, they've been trained, they have become architects, right? And so there is no longer an unskilled population, right? Like when you have 4,000 people in a community working on a project who are literally like, digging out the foundations and ramming the earth by hand and cutting the stones and like looking at drawings, and there's a learning that happens, and it has been formalized, and there are now programs in Africa where they can get the training and their certificates. And so so when a project ends, yes, some people will come back to the United States, but sometimes they will stay and go on to the next project. Mm-hmm. Yep. It was harder than I thought. So when I began, I thought that I was going to partner with somebody actually that I had gone to school with. And he had started his own practice prior to me, but he wasn't licensed and I was licensed. It became impossible for the two of us to partner in the state of New York. I think the state of Massachusetts is the same. It's probably, but basically, because we're in such a litigious society, the person who is licensed takes all the liability and therefore also has to own sort of the entire firm, right? And so it wasn't a model that was going to work for us. We did work together on a few projects, but ultimately we ended up separating. And so I continued on my own, and doing everything yourself can be really rewarding. It can be, really scary when you don't have the next project or you don't have money coming in. But, if you are committed to it and, you can make it work. So it's not something, I find architecture to be, not a solo event, right? So even when you're working with yourself, you're hiring the subs, you're hiring a structural engineer, you're hiring a mechanical engineer, you're like reaching out to your network of people that you've worked with before. And it's, but you're also doing you are sort of like doing it all yourself. And so I think, after doing that as my primary source of work for about 5 years, or about 5 years, that's when I actually sort of made the change and came to Mass. But I think I was ready to be involved in, projects with a lot of people again. So, yep. You make more money though. You definitely make more money.
So I'm Grayson, by the way.
Hi, Grayson.
So you talked about like some sustainability aspects in terms of systems and projects, and I'm in a building systems class now. Sometimes we talk about how like HVAC and other things, like how I say like are typically monitored
I think there's a lot less equipment and stuff that goes into them, right? So the idea is that you are minimizing the amount of energy that they're using. You're minimizing the amount of physical, fans, ductwork, etc. And so if you go into a building that relies on like passive ventilation, right? Basically what you have is an electrical panel room, and that's about it. Like, there isn't very much there, and it's really eye-opening. And I would say that you so yes, you could still neglect them, but it's a much simpler system to take care of, right? So but this is not mainstream in the United States, and I think it's going to take a while, but I think that, what we're facing with our greenhouse gas emissions and climate, temperature rising, et cetera, like there's just nowhere else for us to go. We can't keep, cooling our buildings to the point where we are like frying our planet, right? And so, so in the project with Scenic Hudson, the passive system that we're actually proposing is, it hasn't been done really. Certainly not in this area. There are a few places in the United States that uses something like this. It is much more typical in Europe, but and it's something that the client has. We have to sort of like take them along and get them comfortable with it, because they also are taking a bit of a risk, right? Like it's not going to feel the same as it does in this room or whatever, on a hot 90-degree day when you have the air conditioning pumping. But we have salt for human comfort and ASHRAE standards, which are, we are following all the standards basically. So with a much simpler design. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having me.